Historic Fort Wayne is a Von Buren-style star fort in Detroit, Michigan, based on the Detroit River. Was built in 1841 by Lieutenant Montgomery C. Meigs. Montgomery Meigs was given the orders to come to Detroit basically from building a dike system that he had in New Orleans. And he came up to Detroit and built Fort Wayne. The Fort Wayne that you see today is not the original star fort that was built by Montgomery C. Meigs. Montgomery C. Meigs built an earthened wooden star fort, and today's Fort Wayne was actually the 1862 through 1868 Civil War era modifications. It cost the government just about $250,000. So today you can come to Fort Wayne. It's in southwest Detroit. Get off at the Livernois exit, come to the river. Livernois actually ends right at the main gate, and you come back into a military base. Fort Wayne was used all the way up by the Army until 1972. It was the indoctrination center for the United States Army. More men and women left from Fort Wayne than any other single point in southwest Michigan. So it was a very important fort to the history. As we go back in time, we can talk about the opening shots to the War of 1812. This is even before Wayne was built on this site, and actually was known as Spring Wells Township. In Spring Wells, this is where the Michigan militia fired for 2 hours on British Canada. Directly across the river from us is the historical town of Sandwich, Canada. And they fired. Colonel Hall had to write an apology letter to General Worthington concerning the unruly actions of the Michigan militia during the opening shots of the War of 1812. We also had a Potawatomi village there, and it was also for trappers and French traders and Indian trading posts. So the history goes very far back to the early 1700s. Prior to that, it is all Native American history on the site. Also, toward the end of the War of 1812, this is where General Brock crossed, bringing the British forces across to capture the city of Detroit. The city of Detroit is the only city to be actually captured and held by foreign occupied power for more than 13 months throughout this country's history. And it wasn't until the win of Oliver Perry on Lake Erie that the Yankee Army was able to come back up and retake Detroit, repatriating it back into American hands. So Fort Wayne has played an integral role. During the Spanish-American War, this is where the troops trained and mustered from to lead to the Spanish-American War. During the Indian Wars just previous to that, it was a rest stop for the infantry. Then we move up into World War I, where it became a motor supply and aerial squadrons were based there and played an integral part in Michigan's production into the war effort in World War I. And then in the 20s, we housed the communist prisoners at the fort, of which 280 were sent back to Mother Russia. The rest were repatriated as American citizens. We also had many different military regiments go through the fort, actual Army regiments, not the citizen militias as like the Civil War. And as we move up into World War II, this was the site of the arsenal of democracy. This is where the Lend-Lease program, this is where all the parts for all the planes, the trains, the trucks, the jeeps, the tanks, all those equipment that helped keep Europe moving and keeping Russia and England in the war. This is the site that they had everything brought to, packaged, and sent out. And it went out to the convoys by train, by ship through the Great Lakes, out to the convoys in the North Atlantic, or out to the ports out west in California. So it played a very integral part, but it was again still a muster point up to the end of the Vietnam War. So Fort Wayne in the 60s was probably the most hated place in the city of Detroit by the young men and women who were being drafted into a war they did not want to go and partake in, and that was the Vietnam War. So it has a very unique history. The families that were displaced from the riots lived at the fort. So again, the history of Fort Wayne is tremendous. But one of the big things was the Treaty of Spring Wells of 1815. was signed on the site. And it was the prophet was there, who was a brother of Tecumseh, as well as 15 other tribal leaders. So again, it was a huge, Augustus P. Woodward, Lewis Cass was there. So when you start looking back into Detroit's history, many of the players that we know today in Detroit were at the fort. So the Fort Wayne played a very integral part.